through our research, one of the things that we also did is we put out this sort of call to action, right? That at the end of the day, we need to revamp our thinking. We need to have these feminist values and principles of equity access be embedded across not just the life cycle, but in terms of how we are constructing these data sets, whose labor is going into constructing these data sets.
Hi, this is Tejaswita.
Hi, I'm Shashank.
And this is the CCG Tech Podcast.
Hi, Aarushi. Thanks so much for joining us for the podcast today. And why don't we start with an introduction about you?
Great. Thanks so much, Shashank. And it's a real pleasure to join you guys at the CCG Tech Podcast. I really appreciate the invitation to talk about DFL's work, especially on gender biases and large language models. I mean, as AI continues to increasingly exert its influence in our digital lives, I think I'm very excited to just straight up dive in. To start, a very quick introduction about myself as well as Digital Futures Lab. We are a Goa based research collective. We primarily look at issues at the intersection of technology and society. There are a variety of research themes we really look at, but just to give you a quick preview, we look at AI governance, AI and society in particular. We also look at gender related issues, primarily the growing wide chasm around gender digital divide. We also look at labor futures and a lot of other topics that are not typically featured within the AI discourse, such as the energy and the climate impacts of AI technologies. Over and above this, we also look at emerging technologies such as digital public infrastructure, which continue to dominate the policy discourse within the Indian landscape as well. I am a senior research manager at Digital Futures Lab, and I oversee projects that sort of sit at the intersection of AI ethics, gender, and digital governance. My most recent project, and that is what is going to be the focus of this podcast, is around gender biases and large language models. But other than that, I'm also part of the expert advisory team under Gates Foundation's Grand Challenges work, where we come in and advise organizations across global south, that includes Asia and Africa, in terms of how to operationalize responsible AI guidelines and principles. Over and above that, I was also part recently of the data collection team of the Global Index on Responsible AI. The Global Index on Responsible AI is one of the first of its kind efforts in terms of trying to quantify the progress that countries in different jurisdictions have made in terms of implementing responsible AI principles across different sectors. My work is not all about AI. I also look at digital public infrastructure, primarily around its conceptual underpinnings. So, yeah, that's just a quick preview.
Thank you, Aarushi. I want to start with asking a question about the work you've mentioned, which is on gender biases in large language models. We were curious to understand, number one, what the project was about in like even within gender biases. What did you learn from it?
Yeah. Maybe I'll step back a little just to provide the context in which we kicked off this research in August 2023. As you all will know, that 2023 was really the year of ChatGPT, right? It almost sucked up all the air in the AI arena, so to say. There was not only a lot of attention paid to its impressive suite of capabilities in terms of understanding natural languages and how humans communicate, but at the same time there was a lot of attention paid to how silly, how inaccurate, how racist some of the chat gpt and other llms responses were. Very quickly, llms, or large language models, are a subcomponent of the larger sort of paradigm of generative ai technologies, and large language models are nothing but ex- they're based on transformer architectures, and they have a very good ability to interpret, generate, and process natural languages, and also mimic human communication, right? And we did see that in 2023 there were a lot of efforts to use large language models such as GPT, such as Claude, and build applications that can either be in the form of conversational agents, right? Like the usual chatbots that we're most familiar with, which is in the form of Chat GPT, for instance, where we input our queries in a very conversational manner. And the tool basically synthesizes information and returns it in a way that is very understandable and comprehensible for us. What we saw within the Indian context is that LLMs were being applied to a variety of social sector use cases, right? And this was primarily being done to fill a lot of gaps in terms of information access. So, whether it is, let's say, the sector of agriculture or it is healthcare, where LLMs are increasingly being used to provide super synthesized contextual information. So, for instance, if it is a farmer in Rajasthan and wants to understand which crop to sort of sow next, given the weather conditions and given predictions, an LLM tool can really provide that contextual parochial information, right? We also saw the use of LLMs in certain critical use cases. For instance, a lot of organizations are using LLMs to provide information around topics related to menstruation and a variety of other sexual reproductive healthcare topics, right? We see that LLMs can be used to break down these topics and provide answers that are very contextually nuanced. They are also they're also giving answers in a way that is very understandable by the local population. So there is an increasing trend of customizing LLMs for Indian languages so that they respond to the specific context that social groups in India present. When we started our research, we realized that while there are many examples and anecdotes around LLMs and the kind of issues that exist, they are very much originating from Western context. So you have a lot of examples, famous examples indeed, that a lot of times Chat GPT is portraying extremely racist portrayals of certain ethnic groups. And we also saw that more often than not, it characterizes doctors as male and nurses as female by default. But a lot of these examples are context agnostic in a way, and they don't very much speak to the kind of gender related inequities that we see in India, right? There's a constellation of socio-cultural settings and embedded biases that exist in India itself. And we still did not, at least back in 2023, have a very grounded understanding of the kind of issues that LLMs might portray when applied to the Indian context. So it is really against this backdrop that we kicked off this research to answer two fundamental questions. A, what are the kinds of gender biases that exist across the different facets of large language models? So as we know that LLMs are based on transformer architectures, which were introduced back in 2017, and the back end as well as the front end is complex. There are a variety of things involved, right? There is the underlying base model, so to say. There are word embeddings, there are translation models, and all of them come together to really make this LLM chatbot or LLM application. So we wanted to look at the entire landscape, the entire life cycle, sorry, starting from the problem scoping stage, where organizations are thinking about, okay, how to apply LLMs to a particular context, covering the model customization, model evaluation stages, and right down to the deployment stage when LLMs are actually released for a real world context and for real world usage.
What was the methodology of how you did the interviews and what it was like? What was your experience doing this project?
In terms of methodology, when we started in 2023, the space was very, very nascent. It continues to be very nascent, but back then LLM pilots were just about to get started. A lot of the organizations were still figuring their way out within this landscape, because we'd had the launch of Chat GPT, we had new versions coming, we had a lot of philanthropies who were putting out a lot of funding proposals so that the organizations can come in and start building these tools in a sandboxed environment, right? So that meant that we can't necessarily tap into secondary resources. We can't simply do a Google Scholar search, for instance, right? We have to go back to the people who are building these tools and document and hear from them firsthand what their experiences are, what their challenges are, and most importantly, what their perspectives are around gender bias, right? And even to sort of put more perspective on this, at that stage in 2023, a lot of the focus was on building a minimum viable product. A lot of people were not thinking about how to solve for issues related to biases, for instance. They were more concerned about first order issues. Okay, how do we even get an LLM to produce an accurate result, right? Especially for Indian languages, which we all know many of them continue to be low resourced. And by low resourced, I mean that we don't have enough training data. Since we do not have enough training data, a lot of the AI tools are not super accurate at understanding Indian words, in Hindi language words, or any other sort of Tamil, Kannada, right? And even within this, we do see a lot of the Sino-Tibetan languages such as Bodo, Assamese, etc. Uh, we don't have tools that accurately interpret those languages, right? So the community is really, at that time, the focus was on ensuring accuracy. So when we started this research, we started doing key informant interviews with AI developers, teams that were on the ground trying to build LLM related chatbots. And what we did in our interviews was we primarily asked them to break down the process of how they're going about it. And for each of those process steps, we asked them to provide an overview of gender related challenges that they faced. It could be, just picking their brains in terms of, oh, how do you think women will access this application differently compared to men? Right? In some key informant interviews, we realized that organizations had not thought about those issues. While in some cases, some organizations were way ahead in their thinking, where they'd already mapped the issues and had sort of incorporated them into their design. So we did see a sort of a spectrum of let's say approaches and perspectives when it came to being gender responsive or gender progressive rather. We also did over and above informant interviews. We really wanted to understand how LLMs are being built on ground. So for some of the organizations, we accompanied there to their sites where they were either evaluating their LLM based tools or they were in fact deploying them. So we went to Bombay where we came in as observers for a user testing session around a chatbot that was dispensing information related to sexual and reproductive health. We also went to Udaipur, where we had one organization that was onboarding farmers and agricultural agents onto their platform, which was based on LLMs and provided contextual Hindi language information around cropping practices, pesticides, etc. Right? Both those field visits were really eye-opening for us. That they actually gave us a glimpse of the many intricacies of introducing LLMs in a context that is already low resource, right? These were users who do not speak English. These are users who want to communicate with an LLM in their own colloquial language, in their own dialect. These are also users who are much more amenable to an audio visual format rather than a heavily text based interface. And at the end of the day, we also saw a lot of optimism around these tools, right? That LLMs can really offer us a way to get access to information that physical points or other digital interfaces haven't provided yet. So, for instance, when we went to Bombay and sat down with a group of women who were from an urban slum settlement, we discussed their perspectives on these issues. And one thing that really came out was that LLMs offer an avenue that is non judgmental. They were like, we know a chatbot might not judge us, but a doctor certainly in this area will. Right? So it also helped us view LLM tools as not something that are inherently gender biased, right? But something that also offer avenues for gender transformation and enabling that kind of access to women that they do not have otherwise. In addition to the KIIs, to the field visits, interacting with users, we also had a workshop, an in person 2-day workshop in Goa, where we curated an excellent lineup of digital governance professionals, digital development professionals, gender scholars, as well as domain experts, people who were very well versed in the issues of healthcare and agriculture in India. We had them, all of them, and we basically did a workshop with them to validate the hypothesis we'd created through the research. And this was like a 2 day sprint where we discussed issues from the very coinage of the term indic LLMs, which represent the whole paradigm of large language models built for Indian languages, and the cultural connotations of calling it indic rather than Indian. And at the same time, went into the different intricacies of what does it mean for an LLM to encode Indian cultural values. What are those languages? Who is left out from this vision and who isn't?
Thanks, Arushi, for sharing that. It's been really interesting reading your work and listening to you about how you went about designing these questions and working with people who design and engage with these systems. What I wanted to ask you was, what are typical steps that you've seen in the way AI systems get developed? From your work, you all have split the AI lifecycle into certain steps from, identifying the problem that an AI system should solve to the deployment itself. It'll be very interesting for our listeners to understand from you what are those steps, and then from your work and your research, at each stage, how does gender bias creep in, and of course, basing it on certain insights and interesting experiences that you had while working on this. Over to you.
Thanks, Shashank. And I'm sort of happy to walk everybody through the LLM process. And I know that it's also something that is increasingly popular in the Indian context. A lot of organizations are striving to build that minimum viable product, and it's helpful to sort of get a sneak peek into what the process looks like, right? Now, just to zoom out a little bit and to give you the entire sort of play by play of the LLM lifecycle, and this is mostly from an organization's or an application developer's perspective. One, the team would potentially start with really defining the use case and what the theory of change is, who my users look like, what gaps is this LLM chatbot really filling in, right? And this also includes and potentially understanding the wider problem context, right? What language do your users want this information in? What is the granularity of that information that you need to disperse? And these things really determine your training process, how you design the user interface, etc. The next stage, so this is how we label this as the problem scoping or the problem discovery stage. The next stage that comes is selection of the pre-trained base model. Now we know that there are many models in the market right now. You have GPT available, you have Claude available, and you also have open source models such as Meta's Llama, right? Now, when I'm selecting as an organization which model to really customize, my it can really my criteria for selection could include simply costing, how much would each of these models cost while customizing and gaining access to their APIs. The second sort of factor that goes into selecting LLMs is also how already attuned they are to the Indian context, right? And third factor could also perhaps include which models show low biases and lower frequency of biases. So, for instance, there might be certain models that have a higher rate of inaccuracy and hallucinations and biases. Now, once I've selected this pre trained model, the next step is to start collecting data that will be used to customize this model. And we've labeled that broadly as the model customization phase. And we've broken it down into different steps. The first could be data collection, right? The second is preparing this data. I want to either translate this data, I want to clean it up, I want to make it into a format that is then machine readable. And this is where word embedding models come into play. Word embedding models, and sorry for introducing jargon, but just to break that down, word embedding models are basically models that convert textual corpus or these documents into different numerical vectors. And these vectors is basically a language that the model can understand. So you're basically converting your textual data into a language that the model can interpret through word embedding models. And after your data has been prepared and is ready to be fed into the model, you will then start the actual customization or retraining, fine tuning process of the model. Once your customized model is built, the next thing that you think about is building the interface that users will use to interact with this underlying model, right? And this would be understanding, okay, what is my chatbot window going to look like? Do I also provide the functionality of users recording themselves, or are they simply going to enter their query through, just typing it in, etc.? And lastly, once you've done the user interface design process, the next step is, of course, release, deployment, etc. Sorry, I missed an important stage. So if I could just go back, and that would be right before the user interface is the model evaluation phase, where once my customized model is ready, I want to evaluate it. Now, the evaluation could be done in many ways, right? You could have an in-house team of experts who can basically stress test the model, right? They can check it for biases, for inaccuracies, and across a range of different scenarios, right? How would a model respond in these kind of settings? You can also take this model that you've customized, provide it with an interface, and involve users and actual users into your testing process, where you elicit feedback from them in terms of its usefulness, its suitability, whether it's accessible, usable for them, and any other preferences they might have, right? Now, the customization phase and the evaluation phase, both of them very much happen in an iterative manner. While I've described the process in a very linear fashion, on the ground it looks very different. There's a lot of back and forth between customization, between evaluation, and perhaps even between pre-trained model selection, where you simply might want to start from scratch if you feel you're not getting the results you wanted. After the user design process, we have the deployment process, and this is specifically where organizations have to take those calls. How do they want to release this chatbot in the real world, and how do they want to scale it? One option that is available, especially in the context of healthcare and agriculture, is to introduce the chatbot through intermediaries, perhaps through ASHA workers, through agricultural extension agents, who can then really be the intermediating factor between this technology that is slightly unfamiliar to the general populace and the user who's uncomfortable or who's not very confident in suddenly chatting up with this particular tool, right? So that's really the overview of the entire life cycle. In terms of the gender biases issues that occur, one interesting thing to note is that they're not limited to a particular section of the life cycle. It's an it's a concern that crops up at every stage, and it crops up in different forms. It's not simply that there is a particular life cycle stage that is acting as the source of gender bias, right? You will see these issues manifest in different forms. We also saw that the scholarship that currently exists on gender biases in LLMs is predominantly around quantification of biases in NLP tools such as these LLMs. So you will have a lot of studies that give you, okay, X number of times Chat GPT is giving me a biased answer, right? However, a lot of these studies do not provide a much more qualitative description of what those biases look like beyond just giving us a list of stereotypes that might exist in the data, right? So, what we did as a first step is we undertook a very broad construct of gender bias. We did not limit ourselves to any of those narrow constructs, and we tried to look at gender bias not just at the data stage, but even at the user interface stage, even at the stage of deployment, as well as at the stage of problem scoping, right? And in the process, what we ended up doing are two things. We created two taxonomies. One taxonomy was just breaking down different types of gender bias, and the other taxonomy was around the issues that occur. So, for instance, there are certain points in the life cycle that act as sources of gender bias, right? The real root causes of why bias exists in the LLM in the first place. Then there is a second category, which is around bias blind spots. Now, these are not reasons why bias might occur, but they are reasons why bias might be overlooked or not mitigated. The third category is mostly around structural barriers, right? No matter how conscious an organization is to mitigate that bias, to identify that bias, there are certain structural systemic factors that they have to reckon with, right, that limit their ability to mitigate the bias. So you have these three categories, right? Bias sources, bias blind spots, as well as structural barriers to bias mitigation. Now, keeping that in mind, I'm just going to step into the life cycle a little bit and go from, perhaps just in the interest of time, not cover some of the stages, but focus on those stages that are most relevant to the LLM discourse, and that is model customization, model evaluation, and partially the user interface stage, right?
Right.
Now, coming to model customization, as I broke down earlier, we start with the data collection phase, right? Now, these are issues that are well documented within the AI discourse. We do know that data sets suffer from two issues. One, especially in the Indian context, we have the issue of underrepresentation, where existing data sets, they underrepresent women's experiences. So, in the case of agriculture, if I'm referring to agricultural journal articles, or I'm referring to, let's say, guidelines from the Ministry of Agriculture, I do know that a lot of the experiences or the lot of the agricultural activities that are talked about will be very male centric. And we do know from the same research that there is a very gendered element to agriculture, where females are primarily involved in unpaid manual labor, where their concerns, their issues, their activities remain underrepresented. We just don't have that kind of well documented research, right? Then the second
And this isn't,
area,
sorry, this isn't, sorry, Arjun, this isn't data, right? Like when the data collection stage and the data that's going, the feeding the AI system, you're saying that there's underrepresentation of women in that data. And did you also see the people that you interviewed? Did you also see them being sensitive of this reality? I mean, just to give you a prompt as you sort of continue. Sorry.
yeah. Now, the understanding of those gender gaps in data varies across different organizations. So now there are organizations that are building a general population chatbot, right? They are cognizant of the issue, but have very little avenues to solve the issue. At the end of the day, it's a structural issue that really underpins the way research and development happens within this sector, right? So while they were aware of these issues, some organizations went ahead and did an extra step of collecting fresh data. We also had organizations that were extremely cognizant of those gender gaps, especially when they were building chatbots exclusively meant for women. So, for instance, in the case of the sexual reproductive healthcare chatbot, we saw a lot of the organizations do fresh data collection, right? Going back to these communities, understanding their challenges, as well as documenting this data in Indian language, in local language, and in colloquialisms. So, just to give you a very interesting example for SRH, when we were doing the field visits, the organization shared with us that the Hindi term for abortion and miscarriage is the same. It's garbhpat, right? And our model does not know how to differentiate between the two every time a woman says garbhpat, right? Now, these issues they could only recognize when they stepped into the field and started speaking to women in the kind of languages they used. And they saw that in the day to day, women are not typically also using the word garbhpat, right? They are using words of phrases like bacha girwana, for instance. Now, that kind of colloquialism isn't exactly captured in secondary sources. And so the organizations made extra effort to capture that. But coming back to the inadequacies in the data set, over and above underrepresentation is the issue of misrepresentation in data sets. And this is when the data sets have embedded stereotypes that are very harmful or simply very biased. So, for instance, just continuing with the example of SRH, it could be that the data set that you've collected in some way or another, maybe it's perhaps a transcript from a Hindi soap opera, right? Maybe that's part of your data set. And perhaps that reinforces certain stereotypes or taboos around menstruation. In case that creeps into your data set, it will inevitably lead to biased outputs as well, because the LLM will mimic and reinforce whatever data it has been trained on. Very quickly, coming to the data preparation stage, right? So you've collected your data, you have identified all the resources, and you have, let's say, this list of documents that you want your model to refer to. Now, at this stage, you also might have to do some preparatory steps. So that could include, let's say, translation, that could include labeling the data in a way that is easy to sort of model. You sort of signpost the data that is easy then for the model to interpret and really parse. Now, at this stage, there are a couple of issues from a gender perspective that are important. One that I want to cover and that is super pertinent in the context of Indian languages is the grammatical gender that exists in certain Indian languages. And to just give you an example, let's say I want to translate an English language sentence into Hindi, right? We saw that there are many instances, and in fact, NLP literature on Indian languages covers this extensively. Yeah, the gender biases that happen during translation. So, for instance, I open Google Translate right now and I add the sentence, the cab driver is about to arrive. If I click on asking, on converting it into Hindi, Google Translate tells me cab driver aane wala hai by default. However, if I change that to the nurse is about to arrive, Google Translator says the nurse aane wali hai, right? So there is a very, by default, there is an assignment of pronouns that is, at the end of the day, very stereotypical. How we imagine automatically doctors to be males and nurses as females, even though we know that female doctors exist and male nurses exist, right? So this is one issue that happens when you're translating data. It's not something unique to LLMs, but it is definitely something that is an issue that we've inherited from machine translation models in general. The second issue is around, let's say, data preparation and annotation. So, what I talked about in the previous stage was looking at your data and identifying biases. There are certain subtle and more subjective interpretations of gender bias. And this is the kind of bias that is difficult to identify. It's difficult to build consensus on. So, for instance, if three of us are building this chatbot and I look at a sentence and I might, or Shashank might say that, okay, this is gender biased, right? But the third team member might say that, no, I don't think this is gender biased. This is simply contextually relevant, right?
Yeah, and I read in your work, that you have given this example that when you reinforce or when you train your model, even before that, to based on clinician advice that is seeped in already pre-existing gender bias, then it just reproduces that, which is different from, let's say, when we talk about gender bias at the sort of stage of data collection. No, super interesting. Just was pointing to, I also resonated with this when I was reading your work. Please continue.
Yeah, and for us also, it was, very interesting to see some of these intricacies, because not everything is black and white, right? We might come in with our own value systems as researchers, as feminist scholars, but at the end of the day, it has to be reckoned with the kind of realities we see in the world around us, in our own families, for instance, right? The next important stage, as I discussed, is the model evaluation stage, right? Now, I have this model that has been customized on a certain data set. Now, my next task is to assess its accuracy, is to assess its performance. And in a lot of cases, there were organizations who were using the evaluation to flag bias related issues as well. However, we saw that, and this is where sort of bias blind spots come in, right? We saw that not a lot of organizations were having, using a gender lens for these evaluations, right? So one is very straightforward. assessing your model in terms of, okay, is there any stereotype or bias that the model is creating? That's one. But the other is that sometimes there are certain metrics, performance metrics, that are also gendered in nature. So, for instance, if I want to check how comprehensible my LLM output is to a particular user, that is not a gender neutral question. Women's ability to interpret a text, to read it, and to apply it to their lives is very different from a man's capability, experience, etc. Right? So even though that metric seems neutral, it is not neutral in fact, and it is often not evaluated through a gender disaggregated lens, so to say. The other issue is that sometimes the evaluation of gender bias is altogether omitted. The third we saw that, and this is again another bias blind spot, is that organizations often fail to include gender experts in the evaluation.
Yeah, and to Arshi, to just move the conversation along, because we want to talk to you about so many other things. I know, where do you see, is there any other avenue that you see as critical where the problem lives? Because you've given certain examples of some important critical steps in the life cycle where bias creeps in, but my question is, what according to you is a sort of critical source that goes unnoticed? And then maybe once you answer that, I can hand over to Tejaswita as well, because I know we want to talk about mitigating factors too.
Yeah. So I think in terms of sources, right, we did see most of the sources coming from the data training stage, right? The kind of word embedding model you use, the kind of data you've used to train the model on. But if we move a little farther down, Shashank, to the user interface stage, that also acts as a source of gender bias. And I say this because we have decades and decades of ICT 4D research on how to design the interface of digital tools, right? We know from experience that within low resource context, especially for women, non binary individuals, and a variety of other social groups who live at the margins of our digital world, having extremely digitized textual interfaces is just not the right option, right? We do need to design them in a way that the interface is accessible, understandable, and does not put the onus on the user to retrain or upskill themselves, right? And that was, so the user interface stage was another important stage over and above data where gender bias occurs. And it is also the stage that we realized isn't really talked a lot about within the LLM discourse. Research also shows that women are often not able to access and use mobile devices with complete privacy or with complete autonomy. A lot of the devices are shared across the entire household, right? A lot of the shared devices may be openly used, especially in the case of women with children. They're openly used by all their family members, right? And in that case, we did make the point, then how do we expect women to download these applications around sexual health, etc., especially when they do not have privacy in terms of phone usage? We also saw that there is a tension that exists between accessibility and privacy. So let's say I'm building an SRH chatbot for a user group that doesn't have the capacity to type the questions, right? And to read. They are low on digital literacy and low on general traditional informational literacy as well, right? So maybe the panacea or the way to go around this is to build a chatbot that offers audio interactions where you record your question and you hear out the answer out loud. But what happens when a woman wants to use this application where their mother-in-law is just sitting in the next room? How do you expect them to record their answer and hear these answers out loud, right? And that we saw was like a clear tension between accessibility and privacy, where issues related to gender arise, but many of the times go unnoticed, undocumented within this entire discourse on gender and LLMs. So, with that, I mean, I can just finish like the life cycle all in all in terms of the gender related issues that occur. But there is also a wider point to be made, uh, is simply in terms of the kind of mental models we use to approach LLMs and AI development, right? Sure, we can look at biases, we can look at issues, and we can debias our models, but there has to be a fundamental change in the way AI development is currently happening in India, right? We see a lot of teams that are predominantly led by engineers, led by men, who are building tools for communities they might not be familiar with, for communities whose real world, real lives look very different and are completely dissonant with this techno solutionist framing, right? That AI for good currently embodies. So, through our research, one of the things that we also did is we put out this sort of call to action, right? That at the end of the day, we need to revamp our thinking. We need to have these feminist values and principles of equity access be embedded across not just the life cycle, but in terms of how we are constructing these data sets, whose labor is going into constructing these data sets, are they remunerated or not? And as well as understanding what are those legacy issues that remain unaddressed no matter which new fad, which new technological fad comes in, be it LLMs today, agentic AI next day. But some of those issues continue to be, and the buck has to stop somewhere, right, in terms of doing things fundamentally differently.
Thank you so much for explaining about how biases creep in into AI and large language models. Now to look at how we can deal with this. What are some ways that we can mitigate gender biases in AI? And especially maybe what stakeholders are involved and how they can do the mitigation of biases. This is especially in context of how when AI systems become a primary source of information in critical sectors like you mentioned about agriculture, health, how can we actually ensure that information that's provided through these are in fact accurate, fair, and free from harmful biases?
Thanks, Tejaswita, for the question. And it's a good way to also simply collate everything and really think about what's next, right? Having problematized the entire space. Um, Given the complex nature of the issues we've discussed, right? Very early on in the research study, we realized that our recommendations or mitigation pathways have to be framed across different tiers, across stakeholders. The onus to do this right does not completely lie on product teams, on the technology development teams, right? But they have to be, it's almost a responsibility that's shared by different stakeholders, right? So that is the approach we took when we were framing our recommendations. So we had one set of recommendations for application developers, and these were very granular in nature, right? How to vet your data, how to do an evaluation process that is both cognizant of lived realities of the women that you're targeting, while at the same time imbibes perspectives of experts, right? We also had a set of recommendations that basically spoke directly to the approach that the organization needs to take, whether it is in terms of doing a timely gender analysis and whether it's something as simple as doing a gender sensitivity training with your team, especially people who might not have a background, a disciplinary background in this, right? So that was one set of recommendations. The other set was around a wider constellation of actors, and that included the wider NLP community, a lot of whom are involved in scraping and collating Indian language data that gets fed into these LLMs. A third category was institutional actors. Now, this is where the governments come in, philanthropic capital that is really fueling a lot of these LLM experiments, not only in India, but the wider global south, right? Now, with these three categories in mind, just to start with a very important systemic factor that we see within the Indian context is that there is a lack of resources and guidance support when it comes to providing organizations with the right North Star that can guide their gender sensitive programming of LLMs, right? This could be the this can be sort of illustrated or seen in the absence of any benchmarking data sets for gender bias for Indian languages. Now, the second thing that we saw that we wanted to recommend was for a wider research community. And this speaks directly to the issue that we discussed, is the subjectivity of gender bias, right? We discussed the issues that we discussed today. A lot of them haven't been captured within research properly, right? So how do we build these benchmark data sets? They can't be built from scratch. They can't be built from out of thin air. They have to be you have to go back to the community, understand their lived experiences, and create data sets that can actually help you assess your performance in terms of gender bias, right? And the third set of sort of guidelines or recommendations that we put out were very large, and they were very sort of large scale, in the sense that we need critical AI literacy programs. We need programs that equip users to flag issues in LLMs. The other bit where government comes into play is simply establishing best practices, right? Of course, our work uh, put together some of those best practices, but we certainly do need something more top down, something that comes not necessarily with a compliance or a regulatory backing, but certainly that comes from a space of ensuring that, okay, if you as a team is embarking on a journey to make an LLM tool and expose a vulnerable community to the said LLM tool, these are the minimum standards in terms of ethics, in terms of legalities, that you must focus on, right? And these are exactly the guidelines that are currently missing. They do exist in some form or the other. Either they come from the organizations themselves, which is the usual self regulation, self management of risks. Some of these guidelines come from international organizations such as UNESCO, etc., OECD. But we need something more contextualized. We need something that is India specific and that speaks to the realities of doing this work in India, especially within the social impact space.
Thank you. Just one last question before we wrap this up. What concerns you the most about the way that AI systems are currently being developed and deployed in India, especially, let's say, in the public sector, with regard to how blatantly AI is being used for um, provision of public services and in terms of increasing accessibility?
Yeah, thanks, Tejaswita, for that question. And I think it's certainly a question that has assumed a lot more significance with how we saw the AI Action Summit play out, right? Where we had certain parties swear off regulation, not sign on any of the communiques that came out, and almost mentioned that we perhaps risk over regulating this space, right? And then we had this other camp that spoke about having AI systems that are open, that are sustainable, etc., but may have missed mentioning the safety and the trust element, etc., right? So we do see a lot of facets of that discourse emerging. India is a microcosm of exactly those kind of tensions and debates, right? Where we see at one end that there is a growing fear that regulation or a lot of these safety related conversations can, at the end of the day, hamper innovation, right? Don't want to spook companies, we don't want to spook AI developers. At the same time, we do have this excellent research community that is increasingly focusing on the ethical risks and breaking them down, right? And they're doing it in a very constructive manner, whether it is engaging with developers, understanding their issues, and simply laying it all out, right? But at from the government side, right, and from, in fact, if you will see the kind of regulations, the kind of rhetoric that exists, it is very light touch right now, right? There is the government's perspective is definitely leaning towards lighter regulation, nothing that hampers innovation. And then at the same time, it is also recognizing that there are many other regulatory measures that exist that can be sort of invoked to cover AI harms. However, that sort of conversation only covers a very narrow aspect of AI, which is the risk conversation. Risks happen. How do you identify them? How do you mitigate them? How do you ensure, how do you hold certain developers liable? And perhaps there's So there's a lot of conversation around grievance redressal, right, and management of those risks through, let's say, consent mechanisms, through giving notices, etc., etc. That is only one part. A larger commentary around the very suitability of should AI be used in the first place or not isn't happening. That conversation has unfortunately been relegated to the margins of the AI discourse. And this is something we quite literally saw in the AI Action Summit, where the stage was reserved for conversations around growth policies, right? Pro AI policies, pro innovation. A lot of the critical conversations were happening in sideline events where organizations, social impact organizations, were talking about the very ethics of applying AI in a context that is low resource, that is already characterized by weak institutional capacity to enforce any regulations that might come out, and at the same time, a context where the users of these AI tools might be extremely vulnerable to their risks.
Great, thanks for that, Arushi, and thanks so much for taking out so much time to explain and share your experience researching and writing about this. And I'm completely agree with you that in certain cases we have presumed the use of AI, and the techno solutionist agenda is moving fast and swift, wherever that is. But I'm glad that your work exists for everyone to see, and we're cheering for you and your work. Again, thanks so much for taking out the time. And that's all for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shashank and
Thank you.
Tejaswita, for being
Yeah.
such excellent hosts. I really enjoyed just yapping away about the work we've done, and thank you so much for creating this space for us.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.